The wind dragged over the canyon like a wounded beast, carrying dust, the scent of rain, and the heavy silence that comes before storm. The cowboy named Ryland crossed road slow beneath a sky bruised with thunder, his coat whipping behind him, his horse breathing steam into the chill dusk. He had been running for 2 days, hunted by shadows and whispers. Some called them Apache scouts. Others called them spirits of the land. Ahead lay the cabin, a lonely wooden refuge built against a red cliff, its roof sagging like an old man's shoulders. Smoke curled faintly from its chimney. He reined in, the leather creaking, and for a moment listened. No birds, no wind, only the endless stillness of the desert holding its breath. He dismounted, boots sinking into dry earth, hand resting on his revolver. The door of the cabin groaned when he pushed it open. Inside, the air smelled of pine, tobacco, and something old memories, maybe. He threw off his hat, crossed the window, and looked out toward the distant ridges. Nothing moved, but somewhere out there, he felt it, a gaze, patient and unblinking. As night fell, he lit the lantern and set his rifle by the door. The silence thickened, broken only by the slow ticking of his pocket watch. He poured himself a shot of whiskey from a bottle left behind by the last man who'd tried to hide here. The firelight painted the room in shades of gold and red, throwing long shadows that swayed like ghosts. He thought about the bounty on his head, about the sheriff he'd left bleeding by the river, and about the rumor that the Apache chief wanted him alive. Outside, thunder rolled low and far, like drums in a funeral march. He went to the door again, opened it, and froze. Across the valley floor, at the edge of the firelight, a single figure stood, a woman, tall and still, her black hair blowing like a flag of night. Her eyes caught the light for an instant, reflecting gold. Then she was gone, swallowed by the dark. Ryland's breath caught. The silence returned, heavier than before. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, and the land answered with thunder. He closed the door slowly, feeling the air shift as if the world had turned to watch him. He didn't know it yet, but that woman's eyes would burn through every decision he made before sunrise. Night deepened over the canyon, wrapping the cabin in a blanket of shadows and half-light. Ryland crossed, crouched by the hearth, staring into the fire as embers crackled, the smell of pine smoke mingling with the dryness of the desert outside. His hand hovered near his revolver, every nerve taut, every shadow suspect. The wind moaned against the wooden walls, carried with the faint echo of drums or maybe footsteps, but he knew better than to trust what he heard. Somewhere beyond the cliffs, hundreds of eyes waited, watching the cabin, counting his every movement. His gaze flicked to the door. Outside, the world was black and silent, but he felt it, the weight of 100 unseen warriors, patient, disciplined, poised to strike. And yet, amid the tension, he remembered that fleeting glimpse of her eyes at the edge of the firelight, their golden glow burning in his memory, like a promise he didn't understand. He moved toward the window again, brushing dust from the sill, and peeked into the darkness. The canyon lay empty, yet his instincts told him he was being measured, tested, studied. A low whistle of wind carried through the cracks in the cabin walls, sounding eerily like a call, a warning. He pressed his back to the wall, listening, feeling the pulse of the desert sync with his own heartbeat. Somewhere far off, a hawk cried, sharp and urgent. Ryland's thoughts raced. The rumors, the bounty, the warnings from travelers who never returned. And yet he could not shake the memory of her, tall, silent, watching it with eyes that seemed older than the desert itself. The fire flickered, casting her shadow along the walls, even though she was not there. He swallowed hard, realizing that the desert was no longer just a backdrop. It was a judge, and she, somehow, the jury. Hours passed, marked only by the shifting light of embers and the slow movement of stars across the sky. Ryland finally settled against the doorframe, tension coiling in his shoulders like steel springs. A distant howl split the night, and for a fleeting second he imagined the canyon floor alive with warriors, their faces obscured by shadow, waiting. Then he remembered her eyes again, that silent, unwavering stare. And he knew that whatever dawn brought, the land, the people, and that woman's gaze would shape it, and him, forever. The wind whispered against the cabin, and somewhere deep in the darkness, Ryland felt it. The calm before a storm that would not wait for anyone. Dawn crept over the canyon, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson, but it brought no comfort to Ryland Cross. He stood at the cabin door, hand on the weather latch, eyes scanning the ridges where shadows shifted like living things. The air smelled of sun-baked earth and sage, but beneath it was something sharper: fear, tension, and the promise of blood. Across the valley floor he saw them at last. A tide of warriors, 200 strong, their horses pawing the ground, the sun glinting off their spears and shields. They moved like one living wave, silent, disciplined, and deadly, surrounding the cabin in a circle that had no gaps. The wind tugged at Ryland's coat, whispering to the canyon like a voice he did not recognize, and for the first time he felt the true weight of his solitude. Each breath he drew seemed to carry the taste of iron, each heartbeat a drum counting down to something inevitable. Inside the cabin, Ryland adjusted his rifle, the wood smooth and comforting beneath his hands. He glanced at the fire, now low, its embers casting faint, trembling light across the room. The air was thick with dust and tension. The walls groaned as though the timber itself feared a gathering outside. He thought of the woman he had glimpsed the night before, the golden gleam of her eyes, and wondered if she was already aware of the danger, or she, too, was waiting, a sentinel amid the shadows. Every instinct in him screamed that the desert had set a trap, that this silent army would not act without cause, and yet he could not tear his eyes away from the canyon floor. The warriors shifted slightly, a ripple moving through their ranks, and the earth seemed to hum beneath their presence. The pulse of 200 hearts merged into one, watching him. A lone hawk circled above, its cry cutting to the tense air, and Ryland lowered his rifle just enough to glimpse movement near the center of the encirclement. There she was, the chief's daughter. She stood taller than the others, her posture calm, commanding, and yet her gaze never wavered from him. The wind caught her hair and clothes, turning her into a figure of fire and shadow, a single flame against the dark tide of warriors. For a heartbeat, Ryland felt impossible. 200 warriors could swarm and crush him, yet his eyes were riveted to hers, and in that moment he knew the desert had not sent him here for survival alone. Something older than fear, older than war, tethered him to her. The soldier's silent patience stretched on, the sun climbing higher, but the only sound that mattered was the steady, unblinking stare of the woman who held the canyon in her command. Ryland gripped his rifle tighter, the barrel warm against his palms. He realized then that this was no ordinary siege. This was a test of wills, a gamble played across the sands and shadows, where the victor might not be the strongest, but the one who understood the unspoken bond between watcher and watched. The canyon seemed to exhale, the wind swirling dust across the ridge, carrying with it a whisper of something dangerous, something ancient. He swallowed hard and muttered, "I'm not leaving, not yet." The woman's eyes flickered with a hint of acknowledgement, and for the first time, Ryland felt the full gravity of the desert. It had chosen, and he was the pawn. The heat of the morning pressed against the cabin walls as Ryland Cross crouched near the window, the rifle heavy in his hands, the leather warm against his palms. Outside, the circle of warriors remained motionless, their horses shifting only slightly, the sun glinting off the edges of their shields and painted spears. The air was taut, each inhalation sharp with dust and the scent of sweat and earth. The chief's daughter stood unwavering in the center of the encirclement, her gaze fixed on Ryland, as if he were the only living thing in a world of stone and silence. The wind tugged at her hair and the fringes of her clothing, and in that flickering motion, she became more than human, an emblem of power and inevitability. Every instinct in him screamed that a single wrong move would be fatal. Yet he found his attention drawn only to her, the rest of the warriors fading into the desert haze around her. He shifted slightly, keeping low, ears straining for any hint of sound beyond the wind and the soft snore of horses. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried, sharp and solitary, and it felt like a herald. The desert seemed to hold its breath. Ryland's mind raced, recalling every tale of skirmishes, ambushes, and the wrath of the Apache. But the reality before him was more surreal than any story. He could see the strength in their lines, the coordination, the patience, yet he could also feel the unspoken rule. The chief's daughter commanded their attention, and her decision alone would determine the outcome. For a moment, the world narrowed to the space between him and her eyes, the canyon around them melting into shadow and light. He exhaled slowly, feeling the sweat prickling beneath his hat, the rifle warm from his grip. Time stretched and slowed, measured by the soft scrape of hooves against rock, the distant rustle of wind through mesquite, and the subtle, impossible calm of her stare. It was a stare that knew the canyon, the desert, and him, sizing him up, weighing him, daring him to move. Rylan realized that survival was no longer about bullets or speed. It was about understanding the balance of power, the fragile line between fear and respect, and the strange magnetism that pulled his heart toward her even as danger pressed in from every side. The sun climbed higher, turning dust into gold and highlighting the curve of her stance. Every second felt infinite, and with each heartbeat, the tension in the air thickened, a tangible force pressing against the cabin walls. Then, just as Ryland's hand itched to steady the rifle, she lifted a single hand, slow and deliberate, a gesture that silenced the murmuring wind. He froze, unsure whether it was a sign of mercy or challenge. The warriors shifted subtly at her signal, their formation perfect, disciplined, ready, but no one advanced. His pulse thundered in his ears as he realized that the standoff had entered a new phase, one measured not by bullets but by willpower and understanding. The canyon seemed to close in around him, shadows stretching longer, wind carrying whispers of the past and future alike. And in that quiet, Ryland felt it. The storm had not yet come, but when it did, everything, his fate, the cabin, and the desert itself, would be decided by the gaze of the woman who had already claimed his attention, even before a word was spoken. By midday, the canyon burned under the relentless sun, the heat rising in shimmering waves from the rocks and sand. Ryland Cross moved cautiously near the cabin's edge, the rifle feeling heavier with each step, his boots leaving shallow prints in the dry dust. The circle of warriors remained perfect, a living barrier of vigilance and patience. Yet he sensed the subtle shifts, the way a horse pawed, the slight tilt of the shield, the tilt ahead that spoke volumes in silence. The chief's daughter watched him from the center, her presence commanding the land itself. Every gesture precise, deliberate. Her gaze held him in a grip tighter than any rope. He felt exposed, measured, yet inexplicably drawn toward her like a moth to flame. The desert wind carried faint echoes, distant hawk cries, rustling sagebrush, and the faint metallic glint of the warriors' weapons reflecting sunlight. Each sound felt amplified, each shadow a potential threat, and Ryland's pulse raced as he realized that survival in this canyon required patience, wit, and a careful reading of the unspoken language that bound them. Inside the cabin, the wood groaned under the heat, the fire long since extinguished, leaving only the dry scent of pine and dust. Ryland leaned against the wall, lowering his rifle for a moment to wipe sweat from his brow. The silence outside pressed against the cabin walls like a living thing, and he knew that one wrong move would bring the storm crashing in. His thoughts flicked to the woman again, her eyes locking onto his every motion, unwavering. The circle of warriors seemed to breathe with her, moving as extensions of her will. He considered escape, but the canyon offered no easy paths. Every ridge, every shadow, every fold of rock was watched. And yet, in the midst of impending danger, there was a strange beauty in the precision of their formation, a poetry in the tension that made the desert feel alive, as though it too were observing, waiting to pass judgment on the choices made within the cabin. Ryland's hand tightened on the rifle, knuckles white. The sun cast long shadows that shifted with the movement of the canyon floor, the dust curling like smoke around the horse's hooves. The chief's daughter's eyes never left him, her expression unreadable, a calm fire beneath the sun. He realized that the real test was not bullets or brute strength. It was understanding her, anticipating her, and navigating the silent rules she had written across the desert. The wind rose sharply, carrying sand into his coat and hair, and he knew instinctively that the next hours would decide not just his fate, but the fragile balance between 200 warriors, the desert, and the cabin he sought to defend. Somewhere deep in the canyon, a hawk circled above, its cries sharp, slicing through the oppressive heat. Ryland exhaled slowly, preparing for the challenge he could feel in every gust of wind, a dance of shadows, of patience, and of wills, where every heartbeat mattered, and the desert itself seemed to hold its breath. The sun crested higher, beating down on the canyon floor, making the rocks shimmer like waves of molten gold. Ryland Cross crouched behind the cabin, rifle ready, the heat pressing against his neck and shoulders. Outside, the 200 warriors remained perfectly still, a silent ocean of motionless figures. Yet you could feel their presence in every shifting shadow and glint of metal. The chief's daughter stood at the center, her black hair and leather-fringed garments catching the sunlight, her golden eyes fixed unwaveringly on him. Time seemed to slow. Every breath, every heartbeat became magnified. The wind whispered through the canyon, carrying dust and sand in small whirlwinds, weaving between the warriors' legs like invisible threads. Yet nothing disturbed the perfect circle. Ryland scanned for escape routes, but the canyon offered none. The warriors had anticipated every path. He adjusted his stance, realizing the real trial was not force but observation, patience, and understanding. The woman's gaze held him still, and for the first time he felt the unspoken power of her command. The desert seemed alive, watching, weighing every choice. A hawk cried from high above, its voice sharp and cutting, and Ryland understood it as both warning and omen. The standoff stretched on, tension thick enough to taste. Then, with a subtle movement, she raised a single hand, commanding the warriors to shift imperceptibly. The ground seemed to hum beneath their feet. Ryland's pulse thundered. He knew that the calm could break at any moment, that a single misstep would trigger chaos. Yet the golden gaze that held him did not threaten. It measured, it challenged, it promised a reckoning that was already inevitable. In that suspended moment, Ryland understood the desert had set its rules. Survival, respect, and understanding, bound in silence and shadow. The canyon waited, the sun glared, and the woman's eyes did not leave him, daring him to act, daring him to see the storm that had yet to arrive. The afternoon sun poured over the canyon like molten gold, turning the rocks into jagged pillars of fire and shadow. Ryland crouched behind the cabin, the sweat on his brow stinging his eyes, every nerve taut as a drawn bowstring. The circle of warriors had not moved, yet the tension between him and the chief's daughter vibrated through the desert like heat on stone. Her eyes were fixed on him, unwavering, holding the weight of command and centuries of desert memory. The warrior's silence amplified every sound, the whispering wind to the sage, the distant call of a hawk, the creak of his rifle strap, the soft scrape of boots on dry dirt. Even the cabin seemed to hold its breath, the timber groaning faintly under the oppressive heat, waiting for the inevitable spark that would ignite the storm. Ryland's hands were steady, but his mind raced. The canyon offered no escape. The walls rose on all sides, trapping him in this deadly theater. He studied her, tried to understand the unspoken rules, the language of eyes and posture that bound the warriors to her will. Each breath drew in dust and the scent of sun-baked earth. Every heartbeat matched the rhythm of the encirclement. He knew the challenge was not about firepower. It was about presence, perception, and courage. One wrong move, one twitch of the rifle, and the desert would erupt with death. Yet in the midst of danger, he felt an odd clarity, a connection to the land and to the woman who seemed to embody it. She was no ordinary leader. She was a desert-made flesh, measuring him, gauging his resolve. A sudden shift in her stance made the warriors stir, like wind through reeds, the circle tightening almost imperceptibly. Ryland's pulse spiked, and he realized that the standoff had entered a new phase, one that demanded instinct over strategy, respect over fear. The canyon seemed to hum with energy, each rock and grain of sand alive, observing him, waiting for his next move. The chief's daughter lifted her hand slowly, a deliberate gesture that spoke louder than any word. The warriors froze, and the desert held its breath. Ryland knew, in that suspended moment, that survival would be earned, not fought for, and that the eyes of the woman before him would determine not only his fate, but the judgment of the canyon itself. The sun hung high, merciless, casting sharp shadows across the canyon floor as Ryland Cross edged closer to the cabin's corner, rifle gripped tightly. The desert air shimmered, heat rippling over rock and dust, carrying a tension so thick it pressed against his chest. Outside, the 200 warriors remained statuesque, a living wall of patience and menace, yet all attention seemed drawn to the chief's daughter. Her stance was calm, almost regal, her golden eyes unflinching under the blazing sun. The wind tugged at her hair and the fringes of her garments, turning her into a figure of fire and shadow, commanding the desert itself. Every step Rylan considered felt measured, each movement magnified beneath her unwavering gaze. The canyon seemed to hum, alive with the anticipation of what was to come. Rylan adjusted his grip on the rifle, noting the subtle signals. The slight shift of a horse, a hand brushing his shield, the tiniest stir in the sand. It was a dance of wills, silent and precise, the kind the desert demanded of those who survived it. He realized he could not rely on bullets alone. Understanding her, recognizing the bond between her and the warriors, was the key. Somewhere above, a hawk circled, calling out sharp and urgent, a herald that seemed to cut through the oppressive heat. The cabin creaked under the sun's weight, the walls groaning softly, and Rylan felt every inch of the space around her become a part of the standoff. One misstep, one twitch, and chaos would erupt, yet he was rooted, held in place by the challenge in her eyes. Suddenly, she raised a single hand, slow and deliberate, and the warriors shifted as one, tightening the circle like a coiled spring. Rylan's pulse thundered, sweat stinging his eyes, yet he felt a strange clarity in the moment, a realization that survival here depended on courage, respect, and intuition. The desert waited, patient and watchful, the shadows of the canyon stretching long and wavering over sand. The chief's daughter's eyes never left him, daring him to act, daring him to understand the rules of this land, this silent battlefield. And in that suspended moment, Rylan knew that when the storm finally came, nothing would be decided by guns alone. It would be determined by the heart, the mind, and the courage to meet her gaze unflinchingly. The sun sank low, painting the canyon in molten reds and shadows that stretched long and trembling across the desert floor. Rylan Cross crouched by the cabin, every muscle coiled, rifle in hand, feeling the weight of 200 pairs of eyes upon him. The warriors had not moved for hours, their discipline absolute, yet their presence pressed on him like the canyon itself had come alive. The chief's daughter remained at the center, her posture unwavering, her golden eyes like twin flames cutting through the heat haze. The air vibrated with tension, the wind whispering across rocks and sand, carrying the scent of sun-baked earth and the faint metallic tang of anticipation. Every sound was magnified. The distant call of a hawk, the soft scrape of boot in dust, the sigh of wind to the cabin timbers. The desert seemed to breathe in unison with her, measuring, judging, waiting. Rylan's mind raced, considering every angle, every possibility. The canyon offered no escape. Even the smallest movement could trigger chaos. Yet the danger was not just the warriors. It was a challenge of understanding her, of reading the unspoken rules of command and respect etched into every gesture. The chief's daughter shifted slightly, a subtle motion that caused a ripple through the circle, and the warriors responded as one, tightening their formation with near-perfect precision. Rylan realized that the standoff was more than survival. It was a test of will, a battle not of bullets, but of insight, patience, and courage. Dust swirled in small eddies around the cabin, catching the last rays of sunlight and turning them to gold, as if the canyon itself framed the duel of gazes. A hawk cried from high above, and in that sharp note, Rylan felt both warning and opportunity. He exhaled slowly, feeling the heat on his neck, the sweat stinging his eyes, the rifle steady beneath his hands. The chief's daughter raised her arm deliberately, signaling the warriors to freeze, and the desert seemed to pause with them, the canyon holding its breath. In that suspended moment, Rylan understood the gravity of the encounter. Every decision, every twitch of muscle, every shift of thought mattered. The desert had set the rules, and her eyes were the only guide. He braced himself, knowing that the next movement, whether his or hers, would decide the fate of the cabin, the canyon, and his life. The canyon held its breath as the sun dipped behind the jagged cliffs, turning the desert into a sea of fire and shadow. Rylan Cross moved cautiously from the cabin's edge, rifle lower but ready, every step measured, every heartbeat loud in the oppressive silence. The circle of warriors remained unmoving, 200 pairs of eyes fixed on him. Yet all attention seemed drawn to the chief's daughter. She stood in the center, her golden eyes unwavering, hair and fringed garments flowing like black flames, the desert wind bending around her as though in reverence. The earth itself seemed to tremble beneath their standoff, sand and dust swirling in miniature whirlwinds, carrying the scent of heat, sweat, and impending confrontation. Rylan felt the weight of every decision pressing down, Yet in her gaze, he sensed a challenge beyond mere survival, a demand for understanding, courage, and respect. Slowly, deliberately, she lifted a single hand, and the warriors shifted in unison, closing the circle tighter, the desert vibrating with the rhythm of their silent unity. Ryland swallowed hard, exhaled, and raised his head to meet her gaze fully. It was then he understood. The battle was not fought with bullets, but with will presence, and the bond forged in the crucible of the canyon. He stepped forward, each movement slow, showing no threat, showing only respect, and in that act, the impossible happened. The chief's daughter lowered her hand, a slight nod acknowledging his courage, and the warriors relaxed, their formation dissolving like shadows melting into the desert heat. The tension that had gripped the canyon for hours finally released in a collective exhale, dust and sunlight merging to create a moment of fragile peace. Ryland let the rifle rest at his side, feeling the sweat run down his face, the ache in his muscles, and the extraordinary relief of survival tempered by awe. The woman walked toward the cabin, her stride confident, commanding, yet calm, until she stopped just beyond the threshold and met his eyes. "You've earned their respect," she said softly. "And the deserts." The canyon seemed to whisper in agreement, the wind lifting and carry away the last of the dust, leaving only the silence of understanding, the lingering warmth of the sun, and the unspoken connection between two souls shaped by the land and by courage. As darkness crept over the canyon, Ryland realized the true verdict of the desert had been delivered, not through battle, but through honor, patience, and the courage to meet the gaze of the woman who had ruled it all along.